Hey everyone, welcome to Tent Talk, the Farmers Market podcast. This podcast is all about farmers markets, how to increase your market business success while providing people with fresh food. Farmers markets are essential. Whether you're a farmers market manager or a small farmer or food maker selling at farmers markets, you have found just the right podcast. This week, we're chatting with speaker, writer, and researcher Ragen Chastain and Resource Libraries Coordinator for the Farmers Market Coalition, Nina Budabin McQuown, about making farmers markets inclusive for all types of people. I'm one of your hosts, Bridget Myers. I'm a longtime farmers market manager, Vendor 101 co-teacher, and education coordinator at Farmers Market Pros.
And I'm Kat Fields-White, Director of San Diego Markets, still an active farmers market manager and market consultant, founder of Farmers Market Pros, and host of Intense, the Farmers Market Conference, and the Farmers Market Pros community.
And I'm Justine Marzoni-Mead, Tent Talk producer, marketing director for Farmers Market Pros, and logistics coordinator for Intense, the Farmers Market Conference 2023.
Coming right up. Now is the time to start saving your space. In fact, today's episode of Tent Talk, the Farmers Market podcast, is supported by Intense 2023, the multinational Farmers Market Conference, bringing market managers, farmers, and food makers together again on March 6th, 7th, and 8th, 2023 in San Diego, California. There are no better ideas than those that come from the farmers market hive mind when we all get together. Find more information and register now by clicking the conference button at farmersmarketpros.com.
All right, well, welcome back to Tent Talk, everybody. Today we have two special guests. We are excited to welcome Ragen Chastain and Nina Budabin McQuown to discuss how to make farmers markets more inclusive. We were introduced to Ragen's work through her blog post she wrote for the Farmers Market Coalition titled Creating Size-Inclusive Farmers Markets, and her presentation, Combating Anti-Fat Bias in Nutrition Incentive Work. Ragen is a speaker, writer, trained researcher, multi-certified health and fitness professional, and thought leader in weight science, weight stigma, and weight-neutral health. Utilizing her background in research methods and statistics, Ragen has brought her signature mix of humor and hard facts to college, corporate, conference, and healthcare audiences. Nina Budabin McQuown is on staff at the National Farmers Market Coalition and co-authored the blog post that brought Ragen and this topic to our attention. Nina's work at markets, in fields, and in urban gardens has always taken place alongside research and scholarship on the cultures of food and agriculture. They hold a PhD in English literature, focused on the socio-cultural history of soil, and have many experiences as an editor. At the Farmers Market Coalition, they coordinate the creation, aggregation, and sharing of resources in support of farm direct operators and the local food systems they create. Welcome to Tent Talk, Ragen and Nina.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, I'm super excited.
Thank you.
That was a long introduction.
That was a long introduction. I feel
There's
like you
a
guys
lot to know about these.
That's
two.
like how we
Done such
introduced
cool
Justine
things.
too. I'm like, and she does this and this and this and this and this and this. So we're very excited to have both of you on Tent Talk. This is a great topic that we're excited to discuss with you. We'll just kind of start off with Ragen. Can you tell us a little kind of personal, professional background? Tell us briefly what led you to get involved with weight science, weight stigma, and weight neutral health?
Sure. So I was actually starting on kind of a personal journey, and this is almost 20 years ago now, but I'd always lived in a bigger body and had always been told to lose weight to get healthy, and had been, done a lot of intentional weight loss attempts, a lot of yo-yo dieting. And my background is research methods and statistics. And I am a big enough nerd that even though I wasn't in school and didn't get any credit for it, I decided to do a full literature review of the weight loss literature to find the best diet, the one that worked the most. And I was so surprised at the end of that literature review that I actually did it a second time. And I was like doing calculations by hand, trying to figure out where I had gone wrong. Because what I found was that there wasn't a single study where more than a tiny fraction of people were succeeding at significant long-term weight loss. And the idea of significant was often like 5 pounds in 2 years, which, like, not for nothing, I could lose that right now with a haircut and a loofah. I don't need actually 2 years of an intervention to make that happen. And so that's what got me on the path of like understanding health is not a barometer of worthiness. It's not entirely within our control, right? It's an amorphous multifactorial concept. I wanted to know, like, how do I support my body? And that's what got me on this track of just delving into the research on weight science and health. And then as a ballroom dancer years later, because I had always done activism in college. I did a lot of queer and trans activism at the University of Texas in the mid 90s, which was an interesting time and place to be doing that work. And, racism solidarity work. But I never really thought of fat people as a group of people who were oppressed. I've really conceptualized it as my own little journey. And as a ballroom dancer, a judge came out after a competition and told me repeatedly, kind of pinned me against an elevator to tell me she couldn't stand to look at me. And I know it's such like now when I think back of it, like how totally inappropriate, and in that moment I was just so I was sick, right? So I had had a bad day of competition. So I just said, okay, and she said it again. And I said, okay. And she was like really angry, I guess, that I wouldn't acknowledge that I was, horrifying to look at or whatever. And finally I said, it was a spaghetti strap dress that tripped her up because she could see my arms. And I said, in truth, I probably won't choose to change the dress, but I appreciate you taking the time to tell me it's such a problem for you. And
Good
kind
job.
of I'm happy that came to me in that moment. But that was when I realized, like, I just wanted to be a fat dancer, but I was going to have to be a fat activist to get it done. And of course, this was before I knew about this incredible fat activism community that had been going on since long before I was born. But I started a blog called Dances with Fat and started to talk about my personal journey and think about these things on a more global level. And in 2009, I started to do talks, a lot of which were to healthcare providers because I did have the research background. And that's what I've been doing now for almost a decade full time, is speaking and writing about this.
Wow. What a journey. And it's just so wonderful that you came to full circle and now you're being in service of other people. I mean, what a place to be. What was your relationship with farmers markets prior to the pieces that you've written for Farmers Market Coalition? Because that's how we discovered you.
Yeah. So I, as a farmers market, have only been a participant, a customer. And I've always gone, I think, with my partner, Julianne. And Julianne is super fat and disabled and uses a mobility scooter. And so there are a lot of different types of ways that we weren't included that I was able to see both for myself and then from her experience. And so that was kind of my experience. And then when I was contacted, I was so thrilled to get to write with Nina, who is incredible. So, yeah.
Excellent. So Nina, if you can kind of tell us as well your personal and professional background and how you ended up working at Farmers Market Coalition.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I will just say Ragen is using Write With very generously. I was sort of like, editing and Ragen is an incredible resource for folks who have, questions and thoughts about like what it means to live in a fat body and how to, get healthcare and support and advocate for yourself. So I was so honored to be able to work with her. And my journey to the Farmers Market Coalition kind of starts with farming back in 2007 is when I kind of started farming. And from there, I really kind of never stopped, even as I was doing other things and becoming trained as a researcher and getting a PhD. I was always, like running off to, to disappear for a couple of weeks to like work on a strawberry farm. And my supervisor would be like, "Where are you?" So those things were always kind of intertwined for me, research and growing and eventually selling at farmers markets, which I started doing in 2008. And I worked at farmers markets in New York City and in DC, some of the kind of really big flagship markets and also some tiny little satellite markets. And have always, loved that experience of being under the tent and talking to people about food and getting into all sorts of, crazy conversations with folks about where their food comes from and having people bring you like, the like mashed rutabaga dish that they made with what you sold them. And eventually I kind of came back to the Farmers Market Coalition as both a researcher and, a person who's kind of supporting farmers market managers, which has been like a really lovely kind of bringing together of those experiences and identities.
Awesome.
A magical combination of talents.
Yeah.
For, talk about hashtag our job is weird, to find a job that is just kind of meshes all those things together.
And I have to say, probably your advisor was very happy to find out that when they found you, you were doing something as wholesome as working on a strawberry farm. I feel like there's a lot of academics that jump ship into other things. So.
There's worse places to run off to.
Sounds like the voice of experience.
Yeah. Justine knows.
Our professor over here.
Yes. So what prompted FMC to reach out to Ragen to work on this recent blog post about size inclusivity at farmers markets?
Well, I am a fat person who works in farmers markets, and I have been, kind of noticing and aware of the ways in which anti-fat bias is part of our field since, ever since that first farm in '07. And I was so excited to get to hear Ragen's talk at the Nutrition Incentive Hub conference in 2022, the convening, which is free and it happens every year. And it's always a fantastic event. And this past year in 2022, Ragen was giving this talk, Combating Anti-Fat Bias in Nutrition Incentive Work. And, so of course I went and attended, and both myself and my colleague, Michael E. McGowan, who is also a fantastic public health professional and a fat person in farmers markets. And we both saw it and we were just like, oh my God, this person is amazing. And we would love to have you speak about farmers markets. You mentioned some of those kinds of space and mobility issues. And you talked about marketing in that talk. And we were thinking, well, the operators who work with us would love to know these things and would love to be able to think about them in these concrete and applicable ways. And so, we were really excited to get to work with you on that.
That's awesome. I'm glad that connection was made. Can you tell us a little bit how does this fit into FMC's overall mission for farmers markets? Because you guys do a lot of different work. So how is that connected to that?
Yeah, I think for FMC, and I will say, I'm kind of wearing two hats today. On the one hand, I'm wearing my hat as a staff member at FMC, and then on the other hand, I'm wearing my hat as a fat person and a researcher who writes about fat bias in food systems, and so I'll say for FMC, the way that it fits into our mission is really about creating spaces of belonging. I think thinking about farmers markets as spaces of belonging is really central to so much of what we do at the Farmers Market Coalition and so much of what farmers market managers are aiming to do. And so thinking about how can we be not just spaces of not just access and not just sort of places where folks don't necessarily feel actively turned away or feel tolerated or something like that, but places where people feel really welcome and invited and a part of this thing. And so I think, really all of the ways that we can, make that concretely available to our whole communities is part of our mission.
Yeah. I'm so glad we kind of have some context for this in the way that it fits into the work that we do too at Farmers Market Pros, and just knowing a little bit about both of you, that you're researchers, and also this is something that personally impacts your everyday life and the things that you're interested in. So now we're going to get into the definition portion of our chat today. Just hoping that you can give us some kind of some just clear examples. And first, if you could just define weight stigma, and then maybe give us a couple concrete ways that weight stigma presents itself or is enacted at farmers markets.
So I can start with the definition and then turn it over to Nina for the farmers market examples, if that works. So weight stigma is essentially any time that there's a belief that a thinner body is better than a fatter body. And it's important to understand that it's relative. As a person who's about 300 pounds, I have more privilege than people who weigh more than me and less privilege than people who weigh less than me. So it's not a black and white, simple thing. And so it comes in a couple different flavors. So there's bias, right? And can be intrinsic or extrinsic. So it's a belief that somebody has, maybe they've bought into stereotypes, bigotry, that a thinner body is better than a fatter body, whether they mean healthier, more attractive, etc. And so if it's extrinsic, they're aware of it and they're operating on it consciously. If it's intrinsic, they've internalized the ideas and they're operating on them at a subconscious level. And both of those can happen. There's internalized weight stigma, and that's when fat people ourselves have internalized and believe these messages about ourselves. And so that is a way that fat people participate in their own oppression. And then there's structural bias, and that is when spaces are not made to accommodate fat people. And that can be everything from chairs, aisle widths, MRI machines, et cetera. And so we've got kind of all of these three types of weight stigma that can operate in various ways in various spaces.
Ragen, how did you personally, when you talk about you and Juliana running into barriers at farmers markets, can you give us any kind of specific examples of what made that not a working situation for you?
Yeah, so structurally, often the aisles weren't wide enough, especially for Julie and Scooter to turn around. So we could get into the aisle and then we'd be like, and now what happens? And like people would have to move tables. And so they just didn't think about that. And often there's a lot of intersectionality. Weight bias is rooted in and inextricable from racism, white supremacy, and anti-Blackness. And I absolutely urge folks to read Sabrina String's Fearing the Black Body and Deshaun Harrison's Belly of the Beast to understand more about not just the roots of it, but how it disproportionately impacts those communities today. There's also a lot of intersectionality, and I'm using Kimberly Crenshaw's framework here for intersectionality, a lot of intersections with ableism and fat phobia. And so it's something where fat people who are also disabled and disabled people who aren't fat can be affected by the same structural bias. And so like that was an issue. There were really cute shirts that didn't come in our sizes. There were people who assumed that we wanted to lose weight, which is not an interest for us. And so they would, speak to us, or, oh, we can help you with that. And, or people who assumed that there's often a bias that fat people have less knowledge or information. And so they'd kind of like point out vegetables that were really common as if we might not, this, it's really good for you. And, a lot less calories than, stereotypical food that they assumed we ate. And so that wasn't, I want to say in general, that kind of bias was not as prevalent, right? Those were more, the structural issues were much more prevalent. Most people were very welcoming. Most people were not at least overtly fat phobic. And I think even the people who were, while they may have been well-meaning, they're still doing harm, which is why we're talking about this. But yeah, that was a lot of our experiences.
Yeah, and you jumped ahead with the answer to my next question, which is about intersectionality and how much you see that, with ableism and with racism, and how are we working to make all those things overcome together.
Yeah.
Go ahead. One other example that I would speak to is with transphobia and homophobia and these spaces. So for example, often the restrooms are small porta potties, and sometimes they're even gendered, right? In ways that don't allow for example, non-binary people to feel comfortable, in ways that don't necessarily allow trans people to feel comfortable. So there's that issue as well that I would point out.
Great. Nina, as somebody that's worked in farmers markets and spends a lot of time at farmers market, are there any other examples of the way that this might present, or kind of coming from the operation side or the farmer side of things?
Yeah, I mean, many kind of similar experiences to what Ragen is pointing out, and I think even behind the counters, it can be quite a crunch, as many of y'all know. And I think of maybe one particular moment that sticks out for me as kind of like a good illustration of how this could feel was. I was working for a vendor at a market, and the tent was, it was pretty tight in there. There was a lot of beautiful food, and, the farmer really wanted to showcase it, understandably. And so what that led to was these kind of very narrow aisles behind the counter. And, I made it work. I kind of like danced around everything. I managed not to knock stuff over. And then one day, another person was coming to kind of try out for working at that vendor stand. And I remember watching them try and navigate that space. They were about the same size as me. And just realizing as I watched them how hard I was working, like how much energy I was putting every day into navigating that space in a way where I didn't feel, that I was calling attention to myself, that I was, bruising the vegetables, and then that person didn't end up getting hired. And, part of that was the awkwardness with which they'd moved around the space in the eyes. And I just sort of realized that, and I don't think this was overt or intentional on the part of the farmer, but that for them, the sort of value of our bodies was less. And the fact that we couldn't move around in this space, was kind of ultimately our problem, and less of an issue than the kind of need for an extra 6 inches back there. And that comes from that comes from the whole way that our society values and devalues fat bodies, so that it wouldn't even really occur to this person that 6 inches was worth losing, in order to make space for bigger employees who have so much to give and add to that experience. And I think, if I can speak a little bit to the kind of like bigger structural sort of historical background of this, I think, like I said, I started farming in 2007, and like my first farmers market was Union Square in New York City, and I felt like a rock star. Like everybody wanted to talk to the farmers market vendors. Like it was so in to be at the farmers market at that time. Like Michael Pollan's Omnivore's Dilemma was like still on the bestsellers list a year after coming out or something like that. I mean, it must have been, because people talked about it constantly. Just people were so excited by what we were doing, and that was an amazing feeling to be a part of. And that movement, I think there have been a lot of really, righteous critiques, even though it's done a lot for us. There have been a lot of like, that book is, really based in anti-fat bias. It kind of begins with this like litany of things that, of sort of ways in which we can tell that something is wrong with food in America because of how many fat people there are. And so that, that is kind of the like, that's sort of the nascence of our movement in some ways, in becoming kind of a central, a more kind of mainstream part of American food culture, is tied up with a culture of eating that is, essentially a diet. If you eat this, then America as a whole will be less fat. And so really connected to this diet culture idea, and the idea that people should be thinner, and that if we are thinner, then that's going to show that, American food is on the right track, as opposed to, as Ragen is saying, health is not a barometer of worthiness. We don't owe anybody else being healthy, but that whole kind of structure of like, you should be taking personal responsibility for, how much healthcare costs by eating more kale, is, I think, kind of baked into a lot of the messaging and a lot of the ways that we learn to talk about ourselves, that were really compelling to people at that time. And we have to learn new ways of talking about food, in order to make room for everybody, folks in larger bodies, like people of color, because these things are inextricably intertwined, as Ragen was saying as well.
Yeah, it's so interesting you brought up that Michael Pollan book. I don't know if you've ever listened to the podcast Maintenance Phase. It's one of my favorite podcasts. They're nodding, yeah. But they just recently did an episode about that and kind of deconstructed his argument, and they did talk a lot of crap on farmers markets. So I was like, maybe we need to get Nina on that podcast to straighten them out. But it was really interesting. I really think what you're saying is totally spot on how it really did kind of like pour some, gas on the fire for farmers markets and get people really excited about it and participating and eating local. But unfortunately, I think there were some definitely fat phobic ideas that came along with that excitement. So hopefully the work that we are all doing can kind of or help people unlearn some of those things, for sure.
Yeah, because Ragen, it sounds like you've done some work about the whole misassumption that thinner equals healthier. I mean, that's not necessarily true, right?
Yeah. So there are people of all sizes all along the health spectrum, right? You can have two people of the exact same size with very different health statuses. You can have two people of very different sizes with the exact same health status, right? So this is a situation where we've made weight a proxy for health in ways that are not only inaccurate, but in a society that's also based on a lot of healthism, then creates additional oppression for people in higher weight bodies, and then mixes with messages like, hey, here's, access to food so you don't get fat, or makes food and movement about either prevention of being fat or punishment for being fat, neither of which help people develop like healthy, happy relationships with food and movement in their bodies. And so it's really insidious, the ways that it kind of winds in. And Michael Pollan's book, as Nina was just explaining, is a really good example of that, where we're like, if you see a fat body, here's what you can tell about that body and about what that says about how terrible our civilization is, and, allows people to scapegoat fat people. I have a whole talk on fat phobia and capitalism. So it's an hour and a half that I won't go into right now. But yeah, it really, and a lot of it has been rooted in the diet industry, really sort of hijacking the concepts of health and healthcare to make them about weight and weight loss in ways that have seen them grow exponentially to now $72 billion a year in profit, but haven't actually driven health for anybody, and have driven a lot of shame, stigma, bullying, and oppression.
Because a lot of weight loss programs are inherently unhealthy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, do you want to move on to the working towards solutions and improvement section of this?
Yeah, I'm interested
today?
to see what kind of conclusions y'all have reached on what farmers market operators can do to make their market communities more inclusive for all kinds of bodies. I'm wondering about, so farmers markets across the country and in fact the world are designed on this 10 by 10 tent grid, which is actually a really small retail shop. And does make it really difficult to create a space where a bigger staff member has room to move comfortably. And I'm thinking about it while you're talking, Nina, about being in that little tiny aisle behind the counter, and how does the farmer adjust to that? Should we allow for bigger booths? We're also at urban farmers markets. Part of that grid is designed because there's fire lane restrictions and we have to leave this much empty space, and, which creates a certain size of aisle, which is probably a good thing, related to this topic, but also creates really small retail spaces that are not comfortable for farmers and staff. So, Nina, being in the farmers market community, do you have specific ideas about things that farmers markets as a whole and the way they're set up physically could work better?
I think often kind of when we're dealing with questions of like, how do we design against bias, it's it begins with kind of looking at that grid and saying, okay, well, if our goal is to make there to be room for people, then, let's start there. Let's start with that as kind of a principle of design. And I think, in some ways it's about making that kind of as important as a lot of the other priorities that we might be bringing into play when we're thinking about how to design a space. So, during COVID, I feel like is a great example, and kind of something that I think farmers market operators and customers can kind of think to as we think about like when a priority comes along and we need to make space, and just thinking about space here, but I think it's a great example of like how we did it. We did an amazing job of keeping people safe by creating ways for folks to social distance, to have enough space to move. And, that was not easy. And yet our communities were so grateful for that consideration and for the fact that that we were able to prioritize that and make that room for people to be safe and to shop and to come. And I think it's kind of, pushing questions of access and the kind of like pushing up the list of priorities, the fact that like we want fat people here. I think that is, one of the sort of like things that I really like feel joyful about and feel like, farmers market managers kind of, reaching for that excellent feeling of looking around your market and knowing that everybody's here.
Yeah, and you bring in a good point, not to be like super capitalist about this, but like if we want our farmers to make more money and we want our small businesses that we're working so hard to support, wouldn't you want everyone to be able to come to your market and feel at home and feel like that they could purchase items and be happy about that? So it's kind of like, don't you just want everyone to come to here and feel good about it?
Yeah, absolutely. And at the same time, I think, and I'm sure there's a long explanation of this in Reagan's capitalism talk, but you're combating that with, when you talk about COVID protocols and leaving a whole bunch of space empty, that was economically disastrous for farmers markets, because if you don't fill the spaces with people that are paying to be there to sell and to generate sales, the operation costs for the market turned, a lot of markets went out. They stopped operating because they just couldn't figure out how to make it work. So, yeah, it's the whole capitalism versus humanity
topic.
Yeah. And one of the things that weight stigma does is it says, if it's between money and fat people, pick money. But also it says like, well, fat people are just temporarily wrong thin people. So access inequalities are okay if it's because people are fat, because they could simply get thin and then they could have access. And this isn't just farmers markets. This is what I talk about to healthcare providers all the time, right? This idea that it's okay for fat people to not have access to basic medical equipment and research and pharmaceuticals, because if they got thin, then they could have access. And first of all, we know the research shows that almost nobody has significant long-term weight loss, right? So it's not getting thin is not a thing that is research supported. But even beyond that, like, people are humans in bodies now. And so when we view access inequalities to be acceptable, if it's because someone's fat, then we create spaces that are intentionally exclusive. And we then justify that using fat phobia and healthism and ableism in ways that do a lot of intersectional oppression.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's a solution that, can be worked out and found out between how do we have this farmer's market to where it's sustainable so it can stay open, and how do we also allow for space and inclusivity and welcoming for every person who's coming to the market. And I think that solution is only going to come by talking about this more and being cooperative in conversation. I mean, for us with other market managers, like, how do we make more space and all that stuff? Because it was really nice during COVID. It was great. And there was a lot of space to move around, and our aisles get really tight at our market. It's really busy. We see like 20,000 people at our market. So it's uncomfortable for honestly everybody and just it's just tight to get around. But like Kat was saying, there's no way that market could even stay open if we were to continue with only limited vendors and triple the staff and all of that stuff like we did during COVID. So where is that solution? It's somewhere in between. And so everyone is coming in the body that they're in right now. We're not talking about future bodies or anything like that, and still sustaining that from a business standpoint. So
so I think Nina's got it, that we need to take that as the assumption and priority, and then work backwards from there.
Work back from that instead of back from making those, making the fees.
Right.
Yeah.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. And we're looking at a lot of these like structural issues, but what are some of the ways to kind of combat implicit or explicit bias as market managers?
Well, so some of the policy things. So a lot of farmers market managers at this point, and more from a risk management situation than anything, frankly, I'd like to say that market managers do it just to be good people, but it's also just because they don't want to get sued. They'll have policies in place that require vendors not to make health claims about their products, for instance. There's organic certification, where you can't say something's organic if it's not passed and the holy water has not been sprinkled on it by USDA and all that. So there's policies that we have about language and about how you're able to talk about things to customers. So I mean, would it make sense to have some policies and some training that market managers can provide to farmers and vendors about messaging that carries on weight stigma? I mean, there's probably people that don't think about identifying vegetables for you as playing into weight stigma. They don't realize what they're doing, maybe, because they haven't bothered to think about it. But so on a structural basis, what kind of policies and things could market managers set up and training to change some of that?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question, and kind of a great place for many market managers to think about beginning. And we think about this in anti-racist work as well. If folks are familiar with the anti-racist farmers market toolkit that was created by a group of Black food systems experts and is supported by FMC, one of the, thinking about something like microaggressions, which is certainly one of the ways in which people experience themselves as being unwelcome from a space, even from folks who, they may think this is me welcoming you. And that is about, that is about the ingrained lessons that we all get from living in white supremacy culture. And so the only way to begin to kind of unwind that is to talk about it really explicitly. And, vendor training is a great place to do that, to say, okay, this is what a microaggression is. This is what it looks like. This is what you do when you inevitably employ one someday because this is the culture that you are raised in and taught your social mores in. And these are sort of, they are unacceptable in this space, and this is how we're going to sort of negotiate what that means for us as a community. So I think that is something that can definitely be brought into play around anti-fat bias as well. Just, so many Americans, I think, just do not even think about anti-fat bias as a problem, unfortunately. It's really so much a part of kind of, in many ways, anti-fat bias is often treated like just sort of, well, yeah, of course we are anti-fat. Like, who wants to be fat? And as a person who, is very happily fat, I think it is just a huge help when people are even introduced to the idea that there is not this synonymous correlation between fat and health. And that there isn't really, a good reason to be kind of pushing people in that direction. And I think from that, moment of talking about it on, things begin to get better.
So, I mean, part of what we need to look at then is strategies, and maybe you can share with us some strategies you've developed to kind of address, or to put it a little more aggressively, call out.
Or call in.
What's that?
Or call in.
Or call in, yeah. But how to address weight stigma when you see it. And the first thing that comes to mind for me is Shiny Flannery, who does work on the Anti-Racist Toolkit and manages a market in Portland, and is kind of our unofficial sixth co-host of the podcast because we often invite her back. But what she says, what she taught us all at the conference to say is, we don't do that here, or we don't say that here. And we've used that so many times, and we've used it in training with other market managers and vendors and things. But what kind of strategies do you have? What kind of phrasing, if you have any suggestions on what people can be taught to use as a tool to address this when it's coming up?
I mean, I think "we don't do that here" is a really fantastic phrase for this situation as well. And one of the things that I love so much about that is it just acknowledges, like, the humanity of the person who's being harmed in that situation, and that the goal of being here together at the farmers market is not to cause harm. And so that's not something we do here. And it's de-escalating. It doesn't brook argument. So it's a great phrase. And I think, setting out in the first place kind of what we do here as a set of rules, having a mission, and having a sense of ourselves as a community that doesn't kind of, base the sort of reason for our existence on anti-fat bias. That doesn't, I think is important when we're talking about like why we create farmers markets in the first place, that we are not evoking, and I'm going to use a stigmatizing word here because it's the word that's often used, but that we're not evoking obesity as the reason why healthy food should be accessible, because it's going to keep people from being fat. So, I think in a particular situation, like my own responses are often, along the lines of calling in, partly, in acknowledgement of the fact that we are all affected by anti-fat bias. Anti-fat bias, is, as Ragen was saying, a very different experience for folks depending on the body that you live in, and the intersecting marginalized identities that you're living with. And, if you are looking around a room full of American people, I would be shocked if, 98% of them, to use kind of a loaded number, but not, because that's I believe also the likelihood of failing at losing weight on any diet. But I would be shocked if 98% of them had not at some point tried to control their eating in order to be more thin. And so I think, calling in liberates everybody. Everybody is going to be liberated by a world in which we recognize that it is fine to be fat.
Definitely part of American culture, trying to control that. Nina, do you think, or both of you, but Nina, I know you do a lot of work with nutrition incentive programs and things. I feel like the whole battle against obesity is what a lot of nutrition incentive advocates use when they're approaching Congress people and when they're asking for money. This is what's our good outcome is going to be. Are you seeing, or is there a way to create any change in that kind of language?
Well, I am like absolutely chomping at the bit to talk about that, but I also kind of want to hand it back to Ragen a little bit about kind of talking to people and confronting them, because I know that she has so much experience in like creating tools for exactly that.
Thanks. So I will add, what Nina said was spot on. I do like, we don't do that here. I might also add, this is a space that welcomes everyone, to make it clear like what went wrong in that interaction, because sometimes people don't know. Like they'll think, oh, we don't use that word, as opposed to like we don't say biased things about fat bodies. And I think it goes back to like starting with the core values. As Nina said, this is a space that welcomes everyone. And when we fail to do that, we want to know about it. And we never blame people for their lack of accommodation. And this is another very common form of weight stigma, where like the problem isn't that the aisles are too narrow for this person. People believe, oh, well, this person is too big for this space. This person is too big for that tiny plastic chair, as opposed to that chair does not accommodate that person. So spaces and things should accommodate bodies. Bodies should not have to change to accommodate spaces. And if we start with that as a core value, then it's easy to help call people in and say, oh, like this is a really common belief, but actually what it ends up being is weight stigma. Or check your assumptions. What do you think about when you see a fat person? What do you expect? What are your assumptions about that person? Do you think they don't know what a carrot is because of their body size? Okay, let's talk about that. All of that kind of stuff. But I think all of that is really important. And then starting with our own mouths and doing our own work. Even I constantly have to check, because we live in a world that's so rife with weight stigma that it's just so easy to shop at Crap Mart and then you have to make some returns. And so it's about that constantly looking at, where am I coming from? What do I say with my own mouth? And then, so if it's happening to a fat person in front of you and you are trying to work in solidarity, understand that person may have a lot of internalized bias, like there's no way to know. And so you don't want to jump in ways that reify what just happened to that person. So instead you can make global statements like, oh, I wish we lived in a world where we could just celebrate bodies of all sizes. I wish we lived in a world where we didn't police other people's bodies. I wish we lived in a world where we didn't stereotype people based on how they look. And so you can kind of, rather than like shame on you for shaming, shamer, right? Which is something I might do in situations, but in more general, you can do a more global response and, sort of call someone in that way, in a more gentle way, and in a way that doesn't recenter the person who may be incredibly uncomfortable because of what just happened to them.
I wish we lived in a world where that could be right up there with, we don't say that here.
Yeah.
That's
I love
a good phrase.
What Nina said a couple minutes ago, just like, if you're going to say we don't say that here, you better have
saying it.
Yeah, but you also better have some sort of like code of like what you do say here, or like what the mission of your organization is. Because if you don't have any like written mission that you could then refer to people to, you're kind of just telling them not to do something without giving them an option of what to do.
You always want to go with the positive. So that, I'm already ordering the t-shirts that say that this is a space that welcomes everyone.
Yeah. I think messaging can be used in a lot of different ways too. And I'm just, as you're talking, I'm thinking about things that I see at the farmer's market, things that we say, talking about healthy food. I feel like that is just interpreted in so many different ways by so many people. So what, when we say healthy food, like what are we saying and what's the meaning behind that? And
what are we calling unhealthy food?
Yeah. Are we saying healthy food because it makes everybody just feel good? And when you eat like healthy food can be construed as something that makes your body different if you eat more of it or something. So maybe like this food tastes better than other food because it was grown locally. Like how can we talk about the flavor of foods and things, because then it's not focusing on what it might do to your body and maybe just how you will enjoy it and how everyone will enjoy it. So kind of changing that messaging around that. For farmers market operators, we can just focus on more of those keywords. Or when you shop at the farmers market, you're, increasing, you're helping these small businesses and helping these small farmers. And we do a lot of that messaging, of course, but kind of taking that to the next level and not making it about the individuals that are consuming that food and what they might want for their bodies or for their health or for themselves, but just how are we kind of globally taking care of each other at the market instead.
I can look across the table at you and see you editing your next newsletter post.
I'm writing it right now.
Well, and the concept of healthy is so can be so not just triggering, but it's very different for different people. When we talk about health, we often like to think of it as like something you could throw a dart and hit, or a trophy you could win. Healthy, but it's going to be different for somebody with like who is born with a chronic condition versus someone with no chronic conditions versus someone with 6 chronic conditions, right? Their individual experience of health is going to be very different. And so for someone who is food insecure or experiencing hunger, healthy food is a very different thing than someone who's trying to optimize their nutrients to go and, do a triathlon or something, right? So it's going to be so different for different people. And, there are people with conditions where eating a ton of fresh vegetables is not the best idea for them, right? Is a deeply unhealthy idea. And that's a rare thing, but it happens. So I think when we start to say healthy as if it's a blanket term or healthier, what we end up buying into is a lot of different systems of oppression that harm people in a lot of different ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's there's a lot of work that we can do. And having this conversation and bringing this up and not just saying, okay, we had that conversation, like, check, we're done with that conversation. And just really recognizing that this is just a continual thing and it's work that needs to be done is so important.
It's like any kind of non-inclusivity. It's something that's a constant reframing and learning and practicing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And if you don't mind, I really wanted to hear Nina's answer to the previous question before
please.
They threw it back to me. So if you don't mind, I would love to hear it.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say, speaking to these points that you're making about fruits and vegetables and kind of like what is it that's so valuable and important about fruits and vegetables, and that really brings us to kind of nutrition incentives. One of the things that I which for anybody who doesn't know, nutrition incentive projects are generally in order to increase access to fruits and vegetables. So there'll be things like a program where you buy a certain number of fruits and vegetables, maybe with a food assistance program like SNAP, and then that money gets doubled by the farmers market. So most of us are probably familiar, but just in case. And one of the things that I noticed as I began my work as a librarian and archivist for the Farmers Market Coalition, working with research papers on nutrition incentives, I was, coming into this from a field of the humanities, and I had not really worked with public health research before. And I knew that, most diets fail. And so, silly me, I was pretty surprised when I saw how often the research that supports the idea of nutrition incentives begins with a paragraph that says, because so many Americans are obese, overweight, have BMIs over this or that, therefore we need nutrition incentive programs. But the truth is, and many of these writers, when you kind of look closely at the words, which I love to do, you can see that they know this. There is no logical correlative relationship between how many fruits and vegetables you eat and what body size you are. And so there is no way for nutrition incentive programs to affect obesity. It's just a non-issue. And yet we know, because these have been federal programs, these have been funding streams, that talking about obesity often can feel necessary to researchers in order to get published, in order to get funding. And so, kind of acknowledging that, like, this is not just an overnight, like, all of a sudden we're going to change our language, we're going to immediately, make everything different. But it's also important that we know that nutrition incentive programs are not about making people thinner. And so, part of that is, recognizing that when we're welcoming new people into the farmers market, we want it to be a space that can include all bodies, and recognizing that nutrition incentive programs, we need to know that nutrition incentive programs are not about obesity. And I think that certainly the funding requirements, I would love to see them change. But I also don't want to just say all researchers who use that language are bad. And there are ways when you're writing, when you're justifying, when you're writing grants as a market manager or operator, that if it is necessary for you to use that language, it may be, but that doesn't mean that has to extend through the way you design your program. or the language that you use with people, or the messaging that you use when you are advertising your program. And to, make sure you keep that in mind. And messaging is, in the article that Ragen wrote for Farmers Market Coalition, there's a great section on marketing and on how you can positively show fat bodies at your farmers market. So that is, another concrete solution that folks can reach for. But just recognizing that just because this is the way that we get the resources we need, doesn't mean that has to be a system we buy into in the way we design our programs.
Yeah, great point. And we'll link to Ragen's article as well, for sure, in our show notes, so people can dive a little bit deeper into that.
This has been a great conversation. Obviously, as Ragen says, we could stay on here for another hour and a half on any one of these topics.
This is a 3-part series.
Yeah, it'll be a 3-part series. So we may be back, or we may be seeing you in another venue, but it's been really instructive. I think it's been a really, for people who actively work, our team, really works on inclusivity and being careful of our language and things. And I think I was seeing some light bulbs going on over our heads even. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, and I think this is a great introduction to getting it started.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for the conversation.
Thank you. Appreciate both of you. Talk to you soon.
Yay, thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Nice to meet you.
Thanks for listening today. Enjoy more deep explorations about farmers market issues every week on Tent Talk, and join the conversation at Intense, the Farmers Market Conference in March 2023 in San Diego. Register for the conference now and get ready to keep learning and growing. Find more information and click the Register Now button at farmersmarketpros.com.
Farmers markets are all about connection, and all of us, operators, farmers, and vendors, keep learning. Connect with people just like you from various parts of the country and share what's happening in your area in the terrific conversations over in our private Facebook group, the Farmers Market Pros Community. If you're actively involved in a farmers market, please find us there, answer the 3 qualifying questions, and join the group. You can also message us on Instagram at Farmers Market Pros or email us at connect@farmersmarketpros.com. If you're looking for further education, check out our online course offerings at farmersmarketpros.com. Thanks for listening to Tent Talk. Please leave us a review on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you access your podcasts, and tell us and others how you're enjoying Tent Talk. And be sure to subscribe to our podcast so you don't miss the next episode. Tent Talk, the Farmers Market podcast, is proudly produced by Farmers Market Pros, where passion meets profit. Today's episode was recorded and edited by Justine Marzoni-Mead. Original music by David Mead. Thank you so much for listening today, and we'll have another great episode next week, so tune in.